Did your family have favorites? If so, were you the favorite or someone else?
The clink of glassware, the gentle hum of light conversation, and the smell of overcooked roast chicken hanging in the air. It was another one of those picture-perfect family moments that always looked better in photos than they felt in real life. My mother's 60th birthday had drawn out every branch of the family tree, each member trimmed and polished like ornaments hung for show. And like every family gathering before it, I had shown up because it was expected of me. I had learned to come armed with a smile, a quiet laugh, and a tightrope walker's balance to avoid triggering whatever silent rules seemed to govern my mother's love. I had no illusions left. I was there as a warm body in a dress, seated 2 places down from Chase, the prodigal son with a jawline made for Christmas cards and a resume built on connections and chances I never got. He barely acknowledged me, but that was nothing new. What was new, or at least newer, was the absence of tension in his shoulders. He looked smug in that way that made your skin crawl, like he knew something the rest of us didn't. The wine flowed freely, and Mom, looking more manicured than usual, with a fresh blowout and that gaudy necklace she only wore when she wanted to feel important, tapped her fork against her glass. Everyone turned toward her with a half-curated smile, the kind you rehearse in mirrors before seeing relatives you can barely stand. She rose, glass in hand, eyes wet either from emotion or the third pour of Chardonnay. "I just want to say how grateful I am," she said, wobbling slightly in those ridiculous heels she insisted on wearing even though her knees had been betraying her since her 50s. "Grateful for my family. For the years. For the laughter. And for my children." My stomach tightened. That familiar sense of preparing for an invisible punch crept into my spine. She raised her glass a little higher, almost shaking with sentiment. "To my favorite child," she said, pausing just long enough for people to think she might try to be diplomatic for once. "The one who actually made me proud." It hit like a slap, except slaps don't usually make people laugh. But this one did. The whole table broke into a polite titter, with a few low chuckles and some sidelong glances that danced nervously in my direction. Chase beamed. Aunt Regina reached out and touched his shoulder like she was proud to be in the presence of greatness. And I didn't laugh. I didn't smile. I didn't nod. I just sat there, holding my wine glass by the stem so tightly that I was sure the pressure of my fingers would crack it. But then I did something that surprised even me. I stood up slowly, deliberately, the noise around me dulling into a low buzz like I was underwater. My feet moved across the tile like they had their own idea of what needed to happen next. I walked the arc around the table, past uncles and cousins and people who barely remembered I existed, and I stopped just behind her. In my hand was a plain white envelope. No writing on the front. No fanfare. Just paper. I leaned in slightly, not close enough to make a scene, but enough that she had to turn toward me, and laid it gently in front of her. "Funny," I said, locking eyes with her for the first time that night, "because this came for your favorite yesterday." I didn't wait for her to open it. I didn't even wait for her to react. I turned and walked back to my seat. My hands were shaking, but not from fear. From something else. Something quieter. Something sharper. I watched as she stared at the envelope like it might bite her. Her fingers hovered above it, unsure, then finally pinched the edge and slid it open with the clumsy movements of someone who knew, deep down, that whatever was inside, it wasn't going to be good. But this story doesn't start with that envelope. It starts earlier. Much earlier. It starts in the 4th grade, when I came home with a perfect report card and was told, "That's nice, sweetie. But Chase made the baseball team today." It starts in high school, when I got a full ride to college and she said, "Well, Chase is still finding himself." You know how boys are. It starts with birthdays missed because she had to fly out and help your brother through a hard time, and with hand-me-downs passed off as vintage, and with years of being the background character in someone else's movie. But the envelope, that was something new. Something I hadn't planned for. It arrived 2 days before the party. I was sorting through a pile of mail, half of it addressed to me, half to previous tenants, and one with my name in her handwriting. At first I thought it was an invitation or a card. Something stupid like, "Don't forget to wear blue." But it wasn't. It was a forwarded document. No return address. No explanation. Just a photocopy of something that had been sitting in a bank's fraud department. At first, I didn't understand it. Then I read it again. And again. It had my name, my social security number, my information. But not my signature. And certainly not my permission. It was dated over 3 years ago. A credit line. A substantial one. Opened in my name. Linked to an address that wasn't mine, but very familiar. An address I had visited too many times to forget. My mother's. I stared at it for 10 minutes before moving. Then I did something I hadn't done in years. I called her. She didn't pick up. I thought about calling Chase. But what would I even say? Hey, bro, did mom take out $72,000 in my name so you could start a mobile app that crashed in beta? So I waited. And I brought the letter with me to the party. I hadn't meant to give it to her like that. I hadn't meant to do anything dramatic. But when she said those words, something cold and surgical flipped inside me. Something that had been waiting a long, long time. And now, as she stared at that letter with the fake smile still fading from her lips, I didn't feel angry anymore. I felt ready. I don't remember driving home that night. The streets blurred past like an old film reel, scratched at the edges, flickering with streetlights that offered no clarity. The city was quiet in that deceptive way cities are when the noise inside your chest is louder than the cars, louder than the music, louder than any scream. I sat in my parked car for a long time in front of my building, the envelope still warm from my mother's hands pressed against it just moments earlier. I didn't look back at the party. I didn't wait to see how she would respond. I didn't care to see whether Chase followed her out, or whether the guests stared in awkward silence or resumed chewing their under-seasoned chicken. I cared about something else now. I cared about the way her face looked when the performance cracked. That split second when the corners of her mouth faltered, when her pupils twitched, when her hand started to tremble like an earthquake had opened inside her wrist. That was not a woman who had nothing to hide. That was a woman who realized her secrets were no longer safe. Inside my apartment, I locked the door, kicked off my heels, and walked straight to the kitchen. I opened the envelope again, as if the words would rearrange themselves and say something else this time. They didn't. The bank's letter was polite in the most chilling way. It informed me that a credit line in my name, opened at a branch I had never stepped foot in, had been flagged after several failed repayment attempts. Attached was a scanned copy of the original application. There was my full legal name, address history, even a phone number I hadn't used in 7 years. But the signature wasn't mine. It looked like someone had tried to imitate it and failed, just convincingly enough to fool an overworked branch manager. The account had been opened 3 years ago, increased twice, then maxed out in a string of deposits and transfers that led, eventually, to a PayPal account registered to someone named C. Monroe. My brother's name was Chase Monroe. I knew what it looked like. And I had suspicions. But suspicions aren't proof, and accusations without evidence only make you look bitter. I'd spent enough of my life looking like the bitter one. That role didn't fit me anymore. The bank was offering me a choice. I could take legal action, submit an affidavit of identity theft, and they'd begin the investigation to remove the account from my credit history. But in doing so, they would be legally obligated to pursue the party responsible. If it turned out to be a family member, as their notes subtly suggested, the case would likely proceed to criminal charges. That's what they needed from me. Permission. They were offering me a clean slate, with a string attached that led straight into the chest of my family. I hadn't made a decision yet. But when my mother stood in front of her entire social circle and toasted my brother like I was just an old receipt she never got around to throwing out, the decision stopped feeling like a burden and started feeling like a gift. The next day was quiet in the way that makes you feel like the world is holding its breath. I woke up late. I drank my coffee slowly. I watched the inbox on my phone with a stillness that felt foreign. I didn't text anyone. I didn't check social media. I didn't need to. At noon, my Aunt Carla called. She was the only one in my mother's orbit who ever seemed to notice when things got strange. She didn't waste time with greetings. "What happened last night?" she asked, her voice lower than usual, like she was trying to shield me from whatever was on the other end of her thoughts. "What do you mean?" I replied, stirring my coffee as if the answer were floating somewhere at the bottom. "Your mom's been a wreck. Said you humiliated her." "She humiliated herself." There was a pause. I could hear the click of her lighter. "Carla only smoked when she was anxious." "She said you gave her something," she continued. "A letter." I didn't answer. I didn't need to. "She wouldn't say what was in it," Carla added. But Chase came storming in half an hour later and locked himself in her study. Neither of them came out until this morning. That surprised me more than I wanted to admit. I'd expected her to fold in silence. To protect him as always. For her to tell everyone it was nothing, just another one of her daughter's overreactions. But the look on her face said she knew she couldn't bury this the way she'd buried every other family mess. This wasn't teenage rebellion or an awkward dinner comment. This was paper. Ink. Numbers. Signatures. This was reality, and reality doesn't bend just because someone's wearing pearls. "I didn't do anything to her," I finally said. "She just wasn't ready for someone else to do something back." The rest of the day was filled with stillness, interrupted only by short, sharp bursts of energy. My phone lit up with messages from cousins I hadn't spoken to in months. One sent a photo of the birthday party mid-toast. My mother's face was frozen in a moment of joy she hadn't realized would be the last time she had the room. I almost felt bad. Almost. Then Chase called. I stared at the screen, letting it ring out once, twice, until it finally went to voicemail. He didn't leave a message. 10 minutes later, he called again. Then a third time. The fourth call came with a text. "We need to talk. Now." I didn't reply. I wasn't ready to hear whatever version of reality he wanted to offer. But I knew one thing with absolute clarity. The person who once had the luxury of ignoring me was now scrambling. And when the people who usually talk down to you suddenly want your attention, it's because they finally understand you've stopped asking for their approval. They're not scared of your anger. They're scared of your silence. And I was just getting started. I didn't sleep that night. I lay there, fully dressed, the ambient light from the street painting soft gold lines across the ceiling, watching them flicker like slow-moving cracks. The silence in my apartment had never felt so charged, so thick with questions I was finally ready to let others ask for themselves. I thought about answering Chase's texts. Not because I owed him anything, but because I wanted to hear what lies he'd rehearsed. I wondered whether he had any idea just how much of the damage was permanent, how many pieces had already broken off and were now completely irretrievable. But I didn't call back. I didn't respond. I didn't even touch my phone, because something about the way he kept calling, desperate but wordless, told me he wasn't trying to fix anything. He was trying to delay something that was already coming. And I had no intention of softening the blow. By morning, I had stopped wondering what they were saying about me. I knew how it would go. My mother would call it drama. Chase would say I was making a big deal out of nothing. The rest of the family would keep their mouths shut because people always stay quiet when guilt clings to the walls and no one wants to be the one to scrub it off. But even their silence, this time, was going to sound different. I waited until the afternoon before I opened the group chat, Monroe Family, that cheerful little lie of a name. The last message before today had been a photo of the birthday cake, taken right before I stood up and changed everything. Someone had commented, "Beautiful night." No one had responded since. I could practically feel the hesitation in the blankness. I could imagine them staring at their phones, wondering if they should say something, wondering if they'd say the wrong thing, wondering what I might say back. I didn't give them what they were waiting for. Instead, I went for a walk. Just a few blocks around the neighborhood, past houses where families probably yelled in private but knew how to smile in public. I noticed things I'd never paid attention to before, the cracks in the sidewalk, the way the bakery always smelled faintly of cinnamon around 2 in the afternoon, the woman who always sat on the corner bench feeding pigeons like she didn't have anywhere else she needed to be. It felt good to move. To be quiet on purpose. To not have to justify myself. When I came back, I found another message from Chase, this time not a demand but a weak offering. "Can we meet? Please. Just for 10 minutes. I stared at the message longer than I should have, then finally replied. Tomorrow. 10 a.m. Your place. I knew he wouldn't want me there. I knew he'd prefer somewhere neutral, somewhere that didn't remind me of how many of my mother's favors were buried in that apartment, the TV she'd just happened to find on sale, the custom bookshelf, the rent she had mysteriously helped him with during that year he was figuring things out. I wanted him uncomfortable. I wanted him surrounded by the evidence of everything I never got. The next morning I arrived 2 minutes early. The hallway outside his door smelled like cheap paint and stale cologne. I knocked once. The door opened immediately, like he'd been waiting behind it. His face was drawn, not with guilt. Chase never wore guilt, but with frustration. Like someone who had convinced himself this could all still be fixed if he just said the right thing. He stepped aside, and I walked in without saying a word. The apartment was too clean. Surfaces scrubbed, dishes done, not a trace of his usual chaos. That alone told me more than anything else. He was preparing for something. He was bracing. We sat down across from each other, the silence stretching longer than I expected. Finally, he broke it. I didn't know it was in your name, he said, the words tripping over each other. She told me it was hers. That she'd handle it. Don't lie, I said calmly. Not now. We're way past that. I'm not lying, he insisted, the edge in his voice betraying how little practice he had in being cornered. She said it was just a loan, a temporary thing. Said no one would get hurt. You didn't think to ask where $72,000 came from? His eyes flicked away, and I could see the spin beginning in his head. He was working through which version of the truth would make him the smallest villain. But there was no clean version left. She said it was her money, he mumbled. She said she wanted to help me get started. She helped you by committing fraud, I said, letting the words sit there like a lit match. In my name. He didn't respond. You signed the transfers, I continued. Every deposit. Every withdrawal. You routed it through your PayPal. You used my name like it was a spare key. Chase opened his mouth, then closed it. She said you wouldn't care, he said finally, his voice smaller than I'd ever heard it. She said you'd understand. That was the moment it hit me. This wasn't just about money. This was about how low they had come to regard me. This was about years of being expected to tolerate things that would have broken anyone else. About being told I was strong, while they poured acid on every surface of my life and called it resilience. They didn't think I'd care because they had trained me not to. I used to think it was my fault, I said, standing. That I wasn't lovable enough. Not loud enough. Not bright enough to outshine the one you all kept clapping for. I turned to the door. But I don't believe that anymore. And if you're waiting for me to put this away quietly, you should know my silence is no longer available. He stood, panic creeping into his expression. So what now? You're going to press charges? You're really going to take it that far? I looked him in the eye. You already did. Then I left. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel like the one being left behind. The house was too quiet when I pulled into the driveway, as if silence itself had seeped into the bricks, soaking up the usual hum of forced politeness and thinly veiled insults that had echoed through those walls for decades. My mother's car was parked at its usual angle, perfectly centered, her vanity plate reading Mama 1, a touch she'd always thought was clever, though it felt more like a performance, a constant reminder that her identity began and ended with control. She hadn't responded to my messages, not that I'd sent many, but I knew she'd be home. She always retreated to her domain when the illusion began to crack, when her voice didn't hold the same weight, when people started asking the wrong questions and she could no longer steer the narrative. I rang the bell once. No answer. I didn't bother ringing again. I used the spare key that she always insisted on keeping under the same cracked flower pot beside the porch, a hiding place so obvious it had become invisible. As I stepped inside, the air felt still, thick with the scent of lavender and furniture polish, a smell I had always associated with pretending. Pretending everything was fine. Pretending we were close. Pretending she wasn't capable of choosing one child's comfort over another's integrity, again and again. She was in the kitchen, standing by the sink, not doing anything, just standing, her back stiff, her hands resting on the counter like they didn't know what to do. She didn't turn when I came in. She must have heard me, but she kept her eyes focused on something I couldn't see. I waited. When she finally spoke, her voice was smaller than I remembered it ever being. "I suppose you're happy with yourself now." That was it. No hello. No question. Just a bitter observation, loaded with the kind of emotional bait I had spent my entire life swallowing. I didn't take it this time. "I'm not happy, no," I said, setting the folded paper on the table. "But I am finished pretending that your version of this family is real." She turned slowly, her mouth pulled tight, eyes red but dry. "You embarrassed me," she said, her voice shaking not with sadness, but with disbelief, as if the worst part of what happened was that it hadn't been done behind closed doors. "In front of everyone. You humiliated Chase. You humiliated me." I stared at her, trying to match the woman before me with the one I had spent my childhood craving love from. She looked smaller now, not physically, but in presence. Like someone who had built an empire out of favoritism and denial, only to find the foundation was nothing more than sand. "I didn't humiliate you," I said. "You did that to yourself. I just stopped covering for you." She walked toward the table, picked up the letter I'd placed there, one of the copies from the bank, and held it like it might catch fire. "I didn't think it would go this far," she whispered. "It was supposed to be temporary. Just something to get him on his feet." "You stole my name," I replied. "You opened credit in my identity, forged documents, and lied to me for years. That's not something. That's a felony." Her hands trembled, the paper crinkling between her fingers. "He needed help," she said, more forcefully now, her spine straightening. "He was drowning. And you," she paused, blinking hard. "You always had your life together. You didn't need me." That sentence hit harder than I expected. Not because it surprised me, but because of how plainly it was delivered. She had said the quiet part out loud. I didn't need her, so I wasn't worth protecting. My competence had made me disposable. "I didn't need you," I said slowly, "because I learned not to. Because you taught me over and over that needing you came with conditions. Conditions I couldn't meet because I wasn't him." She sat down at the table, the bravado fading. For a moment, she looked like someone who'd just realized the house of cards had collapsed and there was no one left to blame. "I never thought it would be permanent," she said again. "I thought I could pay it back. I thought he'd pay it back once things worked out." I couldn't help but laugh, quietly, bitterly. Things never work out for Chase, Mom. And yet somehow he always gets saved. But this time, it's not me who's going to fix it. A long pause hung between us, thick with everything we'd never said. Finally, she looked up, her expression a mix of anger and desperation. "So what happens now?" I took a deep breath, choosing my words carefully, because what I was about to say would be the first time in my life I was truly honest with her. "I filed the affidavit," I said. "The bank will start the investigation. They'll follow the paper trail. They'll see the account, the signatures, the transfers, and they'll see where it all leads." She swallowed hard, but didn't interrupt. "And when they ask me who did it," I continued, "I'll tell them the truth. I'll tell them I didn't know. I'll tell them I was manipulated. And I'll let them do their job." Her eyes filled then. Not the controlled tears she used when she wanted sympathy. These were the kind of tears that came when the performance failed, when there was no one left to applaud. "Do you want to destroy me?" she asked, her voice cracking. "Is that what this is about?" "No," I said. "I just want you to finally know what it feels like to be the one left behind." And with that, I stood up, walked to the door, and stepped out into the afternoon sun, leaving behind a house that had never really felt like home. For the first time in my life, I wasn't carrying her shame with me. She could keep it. She had earned it. The letter had stopped trembling in her hand, but I knew that wasn't because the fear had left her, it was because her body had finally surrendered to it. There's a stillness people carry when they realize they no longer have control, when they understand that their explanations won't rewrite the facts, and that the person standing across from them is no longer willing to carry the burden of their guilt. I had seen my mother command every room she entered, had watched her bend family dynamics like wires in her hands, but now she sat in her pristine dining room, surrounded by silence and half-wilted birthday flowers, clutching a copy of a letter that no amount of charisma or charm could talk her way around. She looked like someone who had practiced a lifetime of power only to find herself powerless at the one moment it truly mattered. I had already said everything that needed to be said, and yet as I left her house for the last time, I felt the weight of 1,000 things I hadn't. There was no final scream, no slamming of doors, no dramatic collapse, just the quiet clicking of heels on tile, the soft creak of the front door, and the hush of a world that had, for once, decided to let her sit in the consequences she had so carefully avoided for years. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt clean. What followed in the days after wasn't a storm, but a slow unraveling, the kind of collapse that doesn't arrive with thunder, but with the subtle popping of threads under pressure. The family group chat, which had been dormant since the party, began to stir like a nest of insects under a lifted rock. The first messages were cautious, innocuous on the surface, "Is everyone okay?" and "just checking in," but behind each was a tremor of discomfort. No one said my name. No one asked directly. But I could feel their curiosity pulsing beneath every polite inquiry, their confusion threading each sentence like a hidden plea for someone else to explain what they were too afraid to ask out loud. Then came the packages. One by one, over the course of 3 days, carefully timed envelopes began arriving at the homes of every extended family member who had attended the party. Each one contained a single sheet of paper, a scanned version of the same bank document, with my name printed at the top and the fraud investigation notice stamped in red at the bottom. No cover letter. No explanation. Just the truth, laid bare, stripped of emotion or accusation, because some things don't need commentary, they only need exposure. I had mailed them myself the morning after the party, before Chase had even tried to call. I wanted them to arrive when the air was still awkward, when people were still trying to figure out what had happened. I wanted them to land like quiet bombs, shaking the foundation of her carefully curated narrative without me needing to say a single word. And land they did. I didn't hear from most of them, of course. That's how these things go. Families are expert contortionists, bending themselves into unnatural shapes to avoid direct confrontation. But silence, in this context, was not neutrality, it was awareness. Every unanswered message, every delayed phone call, every canceled brunch plan was a confession of knowledge. She knew it. And more importantly, so did Chase. It was 3 days later, on a rainy Tuesday morning, that Chase showed up at my door again. This time he didn't knock like a brother. He knocked like a man whose walls had finally caved in. I opened the door slowly, already knowing I wouldn't invite him in. His face was different now. Gone was the sharp arrogance, the amused confidence, the infuriating assumption that the world would eventually align itself to his needs. What stood before me was something softer, smaller, more human, but not forgiven. "I didn't know about the letters," he said quietly, the rain dampening the shoulders of his once-pressed jacket. "They're all talking now. No one's answering her calls. Carla won't even let her come to Sunday dinner." "And why is that my problem?" I asked, not out of cruelty, but out of genuine curiosity. Why is her shame supposed to be my burden again? "She's not eating," he said, and for a moment I almost laughed at how absurd that sentence sounded. After everything, her appetite had become the measure of our family's moral compass. "She ate just fine when she was signing my name on loan documents," I said. "She seemed perfectly capable of digesting the consequences when they were mine to deal with." Chase looked down, his shoes darkening with each raindrop. He didn't argue this time. There was nothing left to say that would undo the damage, no explanation that could erase the years of favoritism, of gaslighting, of betrayal disguised as maternal care. He looked like someone who finally understood what it meant to be unprotected, to be the one on the outside. "What do you want from me?" I asked, my voice steady. "I just wanted to say I'm sorry," he said, the words dragging out of him like they had been buried under layers of denial. "I really didn't think it would get this far." "But it did," I said. "Because you thought I wouldn't fight back. Because she told you I wouldn't. Because you believed I was too scared to stop being the one who fixes things." He looked up, eyes glassy. "What happens now?" I didn't answer right away. I let the silence fill the space between us. Then I stepped back slightly and closed the door, not with force, but with finality. That moment didn't need a speech. It needed a boundary. Inside, I sat by the window and watched the rain. I thought about how strange it was that the moment I had dreaded for so long, the confrontation, the exposure, the unraveling of decades, hadn't broken me. It had clarified me. It had burned away the fog of apology I'd lived under, leaving only sharp edges and clean lines. I was not the bitter one. I was not the difficult one. I was the one who had been silent too long, and silence had a cost. Now, I spoke without raising my voice. Now, I wrote letters instead of asking for closure. Now, I watched the damage settle not as a victim, but as a witness. And the beauty of it all, the part that no one saw coming, was that I never once had to raise my glass. She did that for me.